Hello again, everyone. Welcome. My name is Fred Popowich. I'm Scientific Director of Simon Fraser University's Big Data Initiative, and it's my pleasure to be with you today. Je suis très heureux d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Kwikwetlam, Kikite, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and Tawasan's people on whose traditional territories our three Simon Fraser University campuses reside. And I also want to respectfully acknowledge the traditional lands that our speakers and audience reside upon. Before we dive into our panel discussion, I would like to welcome our panelists and give them each about 1 minute to introduce themselves and their contributions in supporting governments engaging in data-driven decision-making. So here with us today we have, and let's go in alphabetical order. Let's start with Ted Cohen, who is a professor of epidemiology and co-director of the Public Health Modeling Concentration at the Yale School of Medicine. Ted, could you tell us more about your background in about 1 minute, within 1 minute?
Great. Thank you, Fred, for welcoming me onto this panel. I am an infectious disease epidemiologist with a primary research focus on the transmission dynamics of tuberculosis, but have also been involved with responses to other respiratory disease outbreaks, including SARS in 2003 and the current COVID-19 pandemic that we're all struggling with. And it's a pleasure to participate in this panel discussion. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Ted. Next, we have Colijn, who's a professor and Canada 150 Research Chair in our Department of Mathematics at SFU. Over to you, Colijn.
Hi, Fred. Thank you. And again, thanks for having me on the panel. I'm an infectious disease modeler based here in the mathematics department at SFU, and I've also worked with Ted on TB transmission dynamics over the years. Some of my interests have been also in genomic epidemiology, where we use pathogen genomes and integrated data to try to understand transmission better. I've been supporting the BC-CDC here in BC in the COVID modeling and forecasting work and informing decision making, and I've also been working with the Public Health Agency of Canada on the national level and provincial level modeling and forecasting.
Great. Thanks very much, Colijn. Next, we have Soyean Kim, who's Director of Digital Projects at Providence Healthcare Research Institute. Can you tell us more, Soyean?
Hi, Fred. It was nice to meet you. Good to be here. So my name is Soyean Kim. I'm the Director of Digital Product at Providence Healthcare. So I'm the head of data science and product development, where my team of data scientists is responsible for development of digital health product with key focus on machine learning and AI. Another hat I wear is that I work as part of the Big Data Task Force at the United Nations. In terms of training, I'm a PSTAT, professional statistician with 16 years of experience. I worked in both public sectors as well as private sectors, such as aerospace, utility, and oil and gas. Good to be here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. Next, I'd like to introduce Lucie Léonard, who is Director of the Canadian Centre for Justice and Community Safety Statistics at Statistics Canada. Lucie, over to you.
Yes.
So we have 1 minute just to tell us a bit about yourself.
Yes. Good afternoon. Yes. So I'm here, very honored to be part of this panel to represent Statistics Canada effort in contributing to big data, data analytics, and predictive modeling. My background is more on the criminology and community safety side, where again, as we continue to move into uncharted times, it would be important, and I could give example of how our work, providing reliable statistics to Canadians have become even more evident and pressing, and to also have proven methodology, trying to be innovative, and also with a lot of stewardship. So I hope I'll be able to contribute, but also learn a lot from this panel and this great initiative. Thank you for the invitation.
Great, merci Lucie. Et aussi avec nous, nous avons Mohammad Qadir, who's President and Chief Scientific Officer of Fusion Genomics. Mohammad, over to you for 1 minute for you to tell us a bit about your background. Oh, and I think you're muted, Mohammad.
Oh, thank you, Fred. At Fusion Genomics, we produce a DNA diagnostics using genomic sequencing, especially for infectious diseases. As part of the COVID, we've been working with various government agencies, which includes the CFIA, the Public Health Agency, as well as international partners, part of the European Union, as well as in the US. Our main aim is to use of genomic technology, specifically our platform, not only to timely detect things like COVID, but actually to prevent pandemics with the ability to identify infections or infectious agents as they move between the human and the zoonotic world.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Mohammad. And listening to all of you there, I'm sure you all of our participants out there agree that we have quite a stellar panel with us today. And on behalf of Simon Fraser University, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us to discuss this important topic. I also want to point out one other person that's out there for us. You'll be able to see his image there as well. And today we're joined by Sam Brad, who is a graphic facilitator and SFU alumnus from Drawing Change. So our conversations and discussions today will be recorded graphically, which means you'll be able to see our dialogue and ideas drawn in real time. A few more housekeeping things for today. Throughout the session, we invite you to post your questions into the QA section at the bottom of Zoom here, which can be found at the bottom of your window there. You also have the option there in that window in the QA section to be able to upvote questions, and you can put just the thumbs up on a question if you want to increase its count, or feel free to write your own question. And we really encourage you to ask a question to a specific panelist. And at the end of the first part of the panel session, we will take some questions to be answered live by the panelists, and that way we can we're really interested in any comments or technical questions, any comments that you might have. However, if you have any technical questions or concerns and that you're having problems, feel free to post them to the chat window that you also have out there. So I wanted to just set the stage for the discussion here. So in the current phase of global alert we're in, data visualizations and predictive modeling have been used in an effort to flatten the curve. Those kind of discussions have been there in our everyday news cycles. And we've been seeing a remarkable demonstration of the power of math, data, and technology, not only in modeling the impacts of COVID-19, but also in driving critical decision-making on urgent issues related to health and safety of our communities. This has shown that models, algorithms, and data are no longer limited to subject matter experts, but are really essential tools for policymakers. And during a crisis, the time, effort, and resources spent on deliberating a course of action can lead to missed opportunities. We really have to be responsive, agile, and iterative, using advanced tools and technologies that make use of visualization, intelligence systems, and sound modeling. These decisions, as well as the actions that follow, must be informed by models based on accountable real-time data. So today we're going to explore some case studies that show how collaborative partnership with Canadian researchers have played a pivotal role in our response and are continuing to play that role in our response to the pandemic to help us to shape and reshape our policy and response mechanisms. For example, I'll be turning it over to her in a moment, but Carolyn's recent project involves creating mathematical models that integrate various streams of COVID-19 data to forecast outcomes. It can be applied to determine the strength of public health control measures or to model future scenarios and assess resource capacity within the community. So our panelists, we're going to be asking them to discuss how data-driven agile partnerships between key players in government, health sector, research institutions will be essential in providing timely responses with potent results. So to get this started, I'm going to pose a first question to Carolyn, which you can respond to, and then we're going to, we have a range of questions and some natural follow-on that will come from this. So, so Carolyn, to give some context, clearly the pandemic has increased the public awareness of mathematical modeling and predictive analytics. and predictive analysis. A two-part question I have for you is, A, what has it been like supporting the government in this instance? And B, how do you feel the greater understanding of this as a tool in developing responses to critical situations will evolve given our recent experiences and even our experiences this week? So over to you, Carolyn.
Thanks, Fred. So what you're seeing here is a slide showing the BC COVID reported cases over time and our early quotes wave or lack of wave, and then in contrast, what's happening today in BC. So this is where we're at, and it's an illustration of one of the models that we developed in collaboration with BC CDC and that's used. So you asked first what the experience has been like. It has been incredibly interesting, incredibly challenging, and it has involved a lot of late nights on occasion. It's always great to see our modeling work coming out in Dr. Henry's slides and sometimes even in Dr. Teresa Tam's slides at the national level to help communicate to the public the scenarios of what might happen depending on what we do. So if we reduce our contact or increase our social distancing, how these curves can bend down or flatten and how soon we might see that after a change. We're really at a change point in BC right now because we're hoping to see the impacts of a change that was made about 11 days ago, asking us to restrict social interactions. Haven't seen that so much in the data yet. So it's been an interesting mix of longer term modeling projects where we do seek to integrate different data sources about timing and how long it takes to get a test and work that into how we interpret reported cases. And then kind of short-term questions, things like, hey, how well are we going to be able to do with contact tracing versus, what happens if people notify their own contacts? How did this work? But, or what's going to happen with schools on a week time frame, like figure this all out. So that's been really interesting. It's involved a lot of volunteers. We have some fantastic people from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So shout out to Sean Anderson and Andy Edwards. And a lot of us kind of putting in time on top of our regular job. So it's been kind of informal and growing and really interesting provincially and I think nationally through groups like the Can COVID Consortium, which pulled together a couple thousand Canadian academics and scientists and researchers who were focusing on it. Okay, you also asked how I think it's going to evolve. I think it will become less casual and hopefully less driven by volunteers. Of course, the pandemic came and we all had nowhere else to go and we were sitting in our living rooms at night thinking, I'm going to model COVID. This is what I'm going to do and like try to support the effort. I hope what we'll do, and I hope that the NSERC capacity building program in this and emerging infectious diseases modeling will help with this. But I hope that we will start embedding modelers in teams together with public health decision makers and together with epidemiologists and public health implementation folks and policy folks. Because I think there's been, there's a tremendous capacity in Canada and across the world and in the US to do modeling, but that translation piece of that modeling result or idea or tool reaching the right decision maker at the right time to support their actual decision, there's sometimes been a bit of a gap there. So I'm hoping we can build that capacity, that we can build training, not just in how to do infectious disease modeling and estimation of parameters in infectious disease and how to work with data, but also in the use of and sort of savvy consuming of infectious disease models and estimates and how to understand uncertainty and what are the kinds of things models can do and what are the key data flows that those models need. So early on, we were often asked to estimate things about what would happen if we, closed restaurants or did a certain thing. And there's just the data were just not there to answer that question. And we'd have to answer it by guessing or explain that that's not something we had the data for at that time. So I hope that we can build capacity through stronger bridges between decision makers and modelers through training in those two ways, training modelers themselves, but also training people in using the models. And through sustained capacity and improved data flows and knowing what the power of those data flows would be.
And in terms of that, maybe Ted, given that you're on the other side of the border there, maybe you might be able to add a bit to what Carolyn has been saying there.
Sure, I was listening with much interest. I think, first of all, I think a fantastic opportunity to learn from the Canadian experience. I think certainly everyone's aware of the particularly catastrophic response that has happened in the United States, which the reasons for, I think, are complex. But the role of communication between data analysts and modelers and policymakers, I think, has been particularly problematic in the United States for the past several years. Carolyn mentioned, sort of the informality of the relationship as it has taken place in Canada. And I think that, that certainly is present in the United States. There's been a lack of real coordination, some intentional, and I think some just the product of a lack of attention to these types of issues, at least for the past several years. I have also been really encouraged by the tremendous spirit of volunteerism. As Carolyn mentioned, no one was working on COVID-19 prior to 2020, and there's been a tremendous pouring out of expertise and contributions of time and skills, not only from trained infectious disease epidemiologists and modelers, but also from individuals in related fields that have something to contribute. I do think that one of the things that I hope comes out of this conversation is some thinking about how to improve this process moving forward. I don't think that it's reasonable to expect that, while we don't know the next epidemic that's going to happen, I think it's perfectly reasonable to expect that there will be another one in the future. No one needs to be convinced of the costs, both health and economic, to societies, and thinking about how not to go through these sort of growing pains of trying to establish these relationships between modelers, data analysts, and policymakers moving forward is, I think, a huge task, and one that we can begin to move forward with now, even before this pandemic ends. So I am looking forward to speaking more to that as we move through this conversation.
Oh, okay, great. I really appreciate those insights there. And I kind of wanted to, Soyean, I'm going to turn it over to you in a moment there, particularly given that with you being here based in British Columbia as well, but also in your role in being associated with being associated with the hospitals and that. So, like for me, it's my perspective. The university may be one thing. My perspective being in the as a researcher is another, but you're there in terms of the hospital being and the health authority being involved on the daily basis. Anything that you'd like to talk about in terms of this on this first question that we've been talking about, supporting the government and this notion of recent experiences of critical response?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the example that the collaboration between SFU Computing Science and then the Providence Health, so that was the sort of agile partnership or informal partnership that was formed very, very rapidly and quickly. And I actually applaud the leadership at SFU to make that happen. So we had this clear question in the COVID context, which was moving very fast, right? So in our case, within BC context and Providence Health context, is that how do we increase the diagnostic capacity at scale, given that this flood of people are coming to the hospital, right? So within that context, we had the very specific question in mind, but obviously, just to have access to world-class talent and resources that SFU were able to offer to us, and then have that sort of collaboration come together very quickly to solve this dynamic and ever-changing problem. So I was very impressed how that partnership came together very informally, and I guess I should say the words agile, very agile fashion. So that was tremendously helpful. I know we're sort of, some of the things that I'm happy to talk more about, things like a data inadequacy, right? So throughout going through that exercise of model building, in this case, the development of a chest X-ray AI model that can detect multifocal pneumonia, we understood our data a lot better. What is the data that we have? What is the data that we do not have? things like label images. So that was incredibly helpful by working with the researchers from SFU to really understand, here are some of the data we can use, and then here are some of the gaps, which led to this creation of data pipeline or infrastructures that we've been building ever since. So it was incredibly helpful to have that collaborations, and throughout the conversation, I look forward to talking more about some of the specific sort of problems and the question we tackle as part of the collaboration.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're telegraphing the issue of data. As you can, everybody not surprised, we're going to be coming back to that one, diving a bit more. Just while we're still sort of on introductory observations relating to the notion of supporting government and dealing with, responding to the critical situation, Mohammad, I'm going to go over to you. Just given that you're representing a company, I'm in the university, but people in the hospital, people involved with government and that. So you're there in a company in terms of like what it has been like. Maybe you can just briefly in a minute or two just talk about the role that you see for not only your own company, but companies in general to be able to support in terms of these partnerships dealing with critical situations. Over to you, Mohammad.
Right, and yes, it is true. We hope that we bring we bring an industry perspective to this interesting dialogue which is happening. Being a diagnostic company which is based on using the power of DNA genomic sequencing, our approach to infectious diseases, which is our main aim, is proactive rather than reactive. What I mean by that is to use genomic testing streams at the hospitals, at the agencies, at the population level, at the human and zoonotic interface, within various geographical regions, within a province, within a country, among the countries. And that way, what we believe in, that you can usher a kind of a new era where, yes, as Ted mentioned, pandemics will happen. We are a shrinking world. We are constantly eroding the human zoonotic boundaries. Humans are encroaching upon where you had wild animals. All of these things contribute to where we are today. So we believe in a proactive approach where we have enough data, that we are generating enough data at all these interfaces, from the human zoonotic boundaries to the patient in the hospital, walking that first patient in Wuhan. So if we can identify these people in time, and then share that data in time, that is to us what is critical. And it is the sharing of data that we believe is the Achilles heel in this equation. For example, we are working with various Canadian federal government agencies. We are working with CFIA directly, with the National Microbiology Labs of Canada. And we are also working with the European Union. And the contrast, especially the people in Ottawa who make these decisions, who are involved with policy, the access or the flow of information, as Caroline has also mentioned, those are the things which are very important to us. We are in a big data world. Once we have 1 million human genomes, which will be equivalent of landing on the moon, or 10 million pathogen genomes, or 100 million. The data is there. It's the flow of data, and the management of it.
And I've been taking my notes here, so I'm going to have a lot of great. We're going to have a lot of great themes we'll be covering today, in terms of this. But before we start diving into some of these issues relating to data inadequacy, data adequacy, and even sharing of data, Lucie, I guess in terms of, we've had different people with different roles in that. Maybe if you could just a few brief comments in terms of basically the role of, since you're with Statistics Canada, the role of working with government. Like, how do you see Statistics Canada as an organization, or your similar organizations internationally, whether it be Stats New Zealand, maybe they have better data in New Zealand. So, but over to you, Lucie, in terms of supporting government, just for some brief comments.
Yeah, that is a big question. But again, I think it goes back to agile partnership that was there prior to COVID-19 for Statistics Canada and being sort of the ultimate outcome for the organization, which is to establish trust. So with very, very strong governance in key aspect of the issue, related to the pandemic, especially on the health side, Statistics Canada, was able to, in a very agile way, partner, of course, with, health partners, but other ones impacted in data collection and dissemination to try to provide what I think has been discussed here and what we're getting at also is about insights on the impact, for example, of COVID on businesses and on the individual. And for StatCan, it meant to do things also in new ways in terms of even if all people were at home, it was not time to deploy large-scale surveys. So again, prior to COVID, this work was started to work on web panels and crowdsource, which both of them could have their limits, but also they have their opportunities, in terms of reducing respondent burden and exploring also alternative sources of information. So from that perspective, during the COVID time, this work that was initiated prior to COVID has allowed StatCan to almost hit the ground immediately and try to respond to some of the requests by Canadian, would say as well, because that's what COVID has showed us, that Canadians have higher expectation around data. And as such, we're able to use those tools, the web panels and the crowdsource, and try to integrate some of this information and the rapid deployment of those crowdsources initiative, for example, for Canadian, and how COVID have affected them. We're able to look at information around mental health, finances, their domestic situation, for many students, the ability to finish school. So the idea was that, high participation, large sample size, but then again, recognizing, because we have methodologists who work with university, the limit, but again, the opportunity of this data to be provided again in a very timely manner, which is often the issue we have as well in gathering data. So I think this is where we have been able to expand the toolbox and again, use the expertise also we have with the partnership with academia, different federal partners, NGOs, and private sectors.
That provides some really interesting context there. Thanks very much, Lucie, for putting giving us some additional things to think about. And I'm going to be going back to Carolyn in just a moment with the next question in terms of this. But we've heard this, the note, and this is where we get to take off the gloves and even ask each other questions in that, and in terms of moving some of the things along in terms of our discussions. We've heard a lot of discussion about the way that the response for COVID, what I have here, has to be informed and agile. But really, I guess one of the aspects with which we've already touched on briefly with respect to being informed, how do we address data inadequacy and I was going to say inaccuracy as well, but let's focus on data inaccuracy, dealing with insufficient data. So Carolyn, anything that you'd like to add in terms of what not only, because you've already made it clear what you've done with the data that you have, and what other kind of data perhaps you might like to have, or what can be done to generate data. So Carolyn, over to you, and then feel free to then direct your questions towards other panelists too. Over to you, Carolyn.
Yeah, that is a huge question, and I will try to be concise, because if given the opportunity to talk about what data we could have and what we might do, it's a lot. I think, early on, I was asked by the federal folks, so I'm on Dr. Mona Namer's expert committee. She's the chief science advisor, and there was a lot of conversation around data gaps, and we kind of outlined 4 basic types of data, only a few of which were partially available in Canada at that time. So I would say, and I won't go through in a lot of detail, but you have your aggregate data, case counts, hospitalization, ICU numbers through time, and sort of with geographical resolution. So that's kind of, we had that mostly. You could have individual level data, line list data that talks about exposure, contacts, age, location, symptoms, likely sources of transmission. That would have been incredibly helpful. We never got any of that in Canada. And the whole world, I think, is still using estimates of things like the generation interval and serial interval, basic epidemiological parameters that underlie all of those RT plots that you see all the time from places like Singapore and Tianjin, China, which released line lists with contact information. There may be other data sets now that I'm not aware of, but if you look up like what people are using, they're citing these analyses from these early data. Then there's, a third type would be population level estimates of things like virus prevalence. We don't have that. We have, not succeeded in getting anyone here in Canada, as far as I know, to actually go out and use a pooled study design and take 5,000 tests and estimate how many people in a jurisdiction have COVID right now. We have to guess at that from reported cases, which are testing a base population that is not randomly sampled. We have serology data. That's another kind of population level estimate of how many people have had COVID. And we do have that across Canada to some extent now, and it's low. So we know that we don't have lots of immunity. And then the last one I think is really interesting and where some of the biggest gaps are, and that's on individual behavioral data in real time. And we're getting some of that now through studies like the Connect study. And we have mobility data streams. We have the Google mobility and the Facebook and the TELUS data for good and the how many people are in parks and blah, blah. But when you have low prevalence and it's bursty and over dispersed, how many people are in a park isn't a great source of information. So I think where we're missing and where I think Stats Canada is hopefully helping out, and there are studies underway, is really how many contacts are people having today in a place? Are they there? Are they outside or inside? Are they contacts within the same age group? How are people modifying their behavior in response to messaging from public health and from decision makers? Are they really only socializing with people they live with in BC today based on, 10 days after Bonnie Henry's announcement last weekend? That kind of real-time data would be valuable. And I think Canadians are not willing to share it. We didn't go the route of a contact tracing app that collects this information. We went with an exposure notification app, and many of us aren't using it. Those data would be incredibly valuable. So you ask, what can we do? I think elucidating what the types of data are and what are the barriers to collecting them and sharing them is first. And I think the second is engaging the public more with the benefits of sharing these data. We all don't want more shutdowns. We didn't expand our testing capacity. We're not doing what Taiwan or Singapore are doing or China in terms of COVID control. We want to be reopened. We want to have these activities in schools and everything open now. We can't under the situation we have right now. Maybe Canadians would be happier about having TELUS or Rogers, these telcos that actually do know a lot about our contact patterns already. Maybe they would be happier with an academic team analyzing anonymized versions of those data than we thought they would be in May. So collecting those data in real time for public health, I think and sharing with Canadians the benefits of that kind of data analysis might be one way forward for all of those types of data, but I think particularly the real-time behavioral measurements.
Okay.
But I'm curious what Lucie and also what Ted would answer about that, because some of what I said was very Canada specific.
So Ted or Lucie, who would like to go first? I'll take a show of hands there. Otherwise I vote. Okay.
Well,
Ted.
I could take the real-time data, which was there again before COVID, because again, maybe being from SACAN and especially my specific area of expertise is on the justice and community safety side. You must have seen, for example, on the policing side and with the event that have happened internationally, it has pushed also in Canada a whole conversation around policing data, both from an oversight perspective, but also just from a reported crime as well, and then what it means for Indigenous here in Canada, for different racialized group. But at the same time, the regular way we collect a lot of data for again on the justice side, it's a year lag. We publish 1 year, but it's the prior. So again, we're talking about administrative data, where how can we make our system more compatible, more seamless, and this is work it was engaged prior to COVID, but COVID has just put more emphasis on the need for this, and now new priorities have emerged. For example, again on the court side, now where we have a virtualization of the justice system, where people want to know who's in, who's out, who's where, and people don't have this system. So I would say the real time is for everyone, the one that have the least capacity, but even other organization, private sector, public sector that do have the real time is a big challenge. But I think we could take it as an opportunity as well to say we might not have the perfect data that we know we can verify, have accountable or audited, but we could put it like that with the right caution and then verify as we go. But I think the real time is key, and we're going to need to be all together working at it.
Perfect. And there's a perfect bridge over to Ted, since I know he's gave him the additional time to think about this. So Ted, over to you.
Yeah, so I certainly, you know, I fully endorse what Lucie and Carolyn went over about, you know, I think they went into quite a bit of detail about the particular data sources and specific concerns about how lack of sort of timely and adequate data have jeopardized the most effective approach that we could imagine. I do think it's worth just stepping back and saying, you know, one of the first investigations I was involved with as an infectious disease epidemiologist was on SARS in 2003. Obviously, epidemic with very different geographic scope. But I'm struck by how over the past 15 to 20 years, methods for analyzing data, methods for modeling have become much more mainstream. Our ability to respond and integrate data has grown tremendously. So I think that's something to celebrate. It's also worth recognizing that in the face of a new pathogen, we're always going to have uncertainty. There's going to be a significant amount of work that needs to be done to understand the natural history of that pathogen, to understand the relationship between interventions and control of that pathogen to some degree. And we need to accept that there's going to be processes and some time in figuring that out. I think we can set ourselves up to be more successful in the future, but I don't think that the experience with COVID-19 speaks to too much of a failing in that direction. My perspective from the American experience, the US experience, is that a lot of the sort of less dare I say, sort of sexy side of data science, the basic functioning of public health surveillance, that has been a tremendous challenge in the United States, and in part reflects the way our government is organized, where we have a system of states, each with their own systems for collecting data. The CDC is intended to act to help coordinate those, but as everyone knows here, has not been able to function in the manner that it's accustomed. And that has presented serious problems for both individuals on the analysis side, but also policymakers in turn, because that information has just not been available in a timely fashion. I give one example. We continue to struggle as we try to understand the progression of this epidemic. There's numerous reports that part of the reason why we see a decreasing infection fatality rate is because we're seeing a changing age mix of cases. But the availability of age-specific data, even at the state level, is not uniformly available, which presents real problems for us. These are solvable problems. This is, I think, a tremendous motivator for us to figure out how, ahead of the next epidemic, we can reinvigorate our public health systems to be able to collect data in a uniform way and make those available so we can make better decisions.
Thanks very much, Ted. Before I pass it on to anybody else that wants to make a comment in terms of dealing with data inadequacy, I have parked this notion of data sharing, which is one thing that we are going to go into, definitely would like to dive into in more detail. And we've been talking about generating generating new data as well. But I think one thing I'm also writing down that we might come back to visit is this notion of the next curve and new pathogens, because yeah, we have, in terms of forward looking. So before we've got all those things parked there, Soyean, do you want any comment that you'd like to make in terms of the notion of how do we address the data inadequacy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I could sort of provide an industry perspective and I guess less academic sort of perspective on this. I think there's a huge divide between sort of, you know, how the data is generated in the first place. So whether it's a government or hospitals, so, you know, those organizations and then the body who interface directly with data subject, right? Whether it's a taxpayer, citizens, or patients. And then that's how data is generated. And then there's a divide, and then there's a people who's going to take the data and process it, make sense out of it. So, I mean, it's not the same sort of group of people we're talking about. So I think the divide is big, what's, you know, kind of leading to this sort of data inadequacy issue we're talking about here. So I don't believe there's one solution that's going to solve all this data inadequacy problem, but based on some of the experiences we've done, I mean, that case of collaboration we've done with SFU researchers. So one problem at a time. Just we had a very clear problem in the context of COVID. How do we sort of increase diagnostic capacity at the hospital at scale? And then how do we solve that problem? So we approached that problem in a very specific fashion. And then we learned that this is a specific data gap we have to tackle in order to solve that problem. So, I mean, so we put in a lot of infrastructures and, and opportunities to data generate to solve that particular problem. So we're kind of evolving in that space. So, but we need to be somewhat focused in terms of what is it that we're trying to solve. And then, this is the sort of data gap we have. If you kind of approach it, I guess the approach going forward that worked for us and we've been successful at it is that one problem at a time and then very focused approach to solve, one problem at a time, which, I hope will lead to over time to address the broader data inadequacy issue.
Sorry about that. I'm going to focus, thanks for that context there, and want to focus in very much more shortly on this notion of the what was flagged already, the benefits of sharing data and this notion of, but before we leave this notion of data inadequacy, Mohammad, is there anything from your point of view that you've noted in terms of, because you've been able to, like you said, you're taking a look at, you've had a slightly different perspective on this. You're also looking towards the next curve in that, but in terms of what have you seen in terms of, dealing with the data adequacy, that things that may potentially have already changed, or what things you think still may need to change in terms of this data inadequacy issue?
So our experience with this is that from a policy to the people who are actively working in agencies like the PAC or the CFIA, is to have them available the tools that they need to go and sample the population, as Caroline was mentioning, that we still don't have studies where we know how it is happening at the population. To us, when we are talking with the stakeholders, it's not that they don't realize it, they don't want it or they don't need it. But in order to incorporate, have those kind of tests or the genomic testing coming from industry to the user and everything, that still falls under a preview of policy and budgeting and federal and the federal budgets to those agencies. So we view it from that angle, that people recognize what they need. In instances, they can identify the tools they need, but they need access. There has to be a more nibble down approach where the people who are at the front can make the decisions.
Okay. No, I greatly appreciate that context there, and and it is setting the stage. And I have another question is going to come up here, and definitely yes, and we are going to be having time for questions from the audience as well for the discussions. I've noticed some people have already started to pose some questions there, so feel free to continue to upvote the questions or add some in there. In terms of since we're still talking about data, and I want to move on to the notion of, which is a natural thing when we're talking about things, data relating to expertise and humans that are involved in the process, but even in terms of knowledge, because it's not just data that we're dealing with here. For making concrete solutions for stuff in society, we need knowledge, we need wisdom, but we'll get onto that in a moment. But this notion of sharing of data, and this is one thing I'm going to just ask everybody to have a few thoughts on, because one of the things with respect to data sharing is part of it is, yes, what are the, was already flagged, what is the benefits of sharing data? Many people do not see potentially what those benefits are. Many organizations may not see it. And we're talking about sharing not only from the point of view of organizations, but of individuals. And we're dealing with it in different jurisdictions where there may be different regulations relating to what things are allowed to be shared, or even different perspectives in terms of how different governments say what they want to have shared in terms of that. So in terms of that, that high level of benefits of sharing of data, and that, Carolyn, maybe I could just bring it back to you in terms of that, because, and perhaps put it in the context of maybe what's been frustrating for you when you see certain data, people in certain countries have access to data, whereas in certain regions, we are either not collecting that data, or the data is there and we just don't have access to it because we don't have this app, or the company won't provide the mobile company will not provide data, and so on. So Carolyn, over to you for some initial thoughts in terms of that sharing of data aspect.
Okay, so two kind of pain points there. I think I'll start with the less important one, and then maybe what I think is more fundamental. So yeah, I think there's some disconnect in public attitudes. So I think we are pretty much happy with Google, Twitter, Facebook, TELUS, Rogers, and so on, having access to exactly where we are, what we're searching for on the internet, what we're saying, who we're connected to, what news we're reading, how long we read it for, and a lot of other information about us, exactly which other devices are nearby on a given moment, where we go throughout the day. We are very happy for those organizations to have those data and to hold them and to use them to show us selected pieces of information and news, and to direct our attention across the internet and to market ideas and products to us. We are not happy with academic organizations analyzing any small anonymized slice of those data to answer questions like how many COVID-related contacts, even as a ballpark, or how much transmission risk is happening in a given type of activity. So I think there's a disconnect there, that we are happy for that information to be used by, in our case here, foreign organizations and held, in the US for these tasks, and that, I think the political implications of that and the misinformation implications and the social bubbles and the cultural dynamics of that are profound, and we're happy for that. But we're not happy somehow to stop COVID with those data, and I think that's a frustration. But I actually think, what Ted said in response to the last question is probably more important. We were kind of screaming about data a little bit more in the first place, because I thought we should do at least one pooled study design somewhere where we estimated virus prevalence and got a handle on how many of the true cases are we actually reporting. But right now, those aren't the main challenges. The challenges are we have a raging pandemic and we're not doing enough about it to stop it. And that's, partly because, I can't really say that if I had X pieces of data, we'd be done. And as long as modelers have contact tracing data, we could stop COVID. Clearly, that's not where it's at, right? Where it's at is we didn't build out rapid testing and very widespread testing. We didn't take a plan for what we were going to do, along the lines of, the very strict measures that China does, which probably don't fit Canadian or American populations. The Taiwan, method of, they test all these contact symptoms or otherwise, they follow up, they test, if they find an asymptomatic contact who's positive, they follow them up and trace their contacts. So much more, getting ahead of transmission. So we didn't do that, and we reopened, and we knew, the science was there, the data was there about whether, if you test someone who is symptomatic and then you wait a couple of days for them to seek a test and the test to get turned around, and then you wait a couple more days for public health to reach out to their contacts. Like the first papers on contact tracing showed that wasn't basically going to work. And we rolled out that plan, knowing that data, knowing that science. So that's, I guess, and I'll do one third pain point, I guess. One reason that we weren't kind of up to speed on exactly how some of these things were going in real time is that we have had public health infrastructure that has been underfunded for 10 years or more in a lot of provinces. And people are gathering information with fax machines and sending it around. In BC, we have a system called Panorama. David Patrick described it yesterday in a panel that I was on for this conference with Kara Tannenbaum and others. And his comments were that, they had gone with this sort of big IT, IBM solution. It wasn't driven as much by the needs of the people who would be entering the data. And so it hasn't really met the needs that they wanted. But there isn't systematic collection of kind of contact tracing data and so on. But at the same time, I think that's more a broad question of public health infrastructure and linkage and decision making than it is of whether someone like me can access key pieces of data.
Okay, and thanks very much, Carolyn, there. And you already set the context. I'm going to follow on Ted in this because you planted a few seeds there in terms of, and it's always a natural, sorry for picking on you, Ted, but your perspective on the other side of the border, it's what we can learn from others is always so important in a situation like this. So you care to comment in terms of follow on from some of the things that Carolyn's commented on there, or the aspects of sharing data?
Yeah, so the lessons learned from the United States in this case are certainly not ones about, examples we've set. I think, I'm speaking from the perspective of, in this case, a data consumer, and I think it's always easy for a data consumer to be unhappy with the manner or the content of the data that they're getting. And I think that there's real distance to go there, and there are lessons to be learned. But I think another part of this issue is a lack of understanding between. There's a few places where there's a lack of understanding. There's a lack of understanding between policymakers and academics or other data analysts who would use the data about even the business models for how these organizations run. And I think that in important ways hampers our ability to work together. So real investment. So Carolyn had mentioned at the very beginning of this talk about the idea of embedding modelers within larger teams. I think that would be invaluable moving forward to try to understand how to iron out some of these gaps about how data are collected and then used. I also think that there are good reasons for the public to be concerned about how their data are used. I think Carolyn brings up, a really important contrast in the way people apparently seem to be happy with companies having access to highly individualized data. But I don't think it's enough to just draw that contrast. I think there's a lot of work to be done to help the public understand how data actually can be used to improve their lives, both from a health perspective and from an economic perspective. And it's clear to me that we have not done a good enough job in making that case. I'm not sure how to do it, but there's a huge amount of work to go. And frankly, I think in the US system, and it may be true in Canada, that change is only going to happen at the governmental level when the public is demanding it. And I think that's a huge failure at this point, and one in which there's a lot of work to be done.
Okay, good insights there, Ted. And I'm going to be going to Lucie in a moment too, because you said the word data so many times there in government. I could not resist but asking her a bit more information from StatsCan. But after Lucie's responded there and being mindful of the time, please do continue to put your questions in, audience, and we'll be getting to them hopefully starting in about 10 minutes. But I am then going to expand this out when I'm bringing Soyean and Mohammad in for the aspect of this notion of sharing. But Lucie, if you want to make some comments in terms of the data sharing and maybe the government perspective even.
Yes, it is a very important issue, and one that has been at the central, a central part of what we call modernization as CSPC Canada. And for those of you who are less familiar with Canada, we know, for example, the province of Ontario as well has announced a big data modernization. And what it means is some key principle to follow, in terms of being more user-centric, be more transparent in providing the most reliable data. But as part of this process as well, at StatCan, at least there's been a lot of work done with the Privacy Commissioner. The principle that came out of that was to try to move against Statistical Canada. It's maybe one of the most respected agencies in terms of privacy of information for national statistic agencies. But as you all know, there's been some issues as well. And so the way Statistic Canada has reinforced that was around the principle of necessity and proportionality. So in terms of, taking the privacy of Canadians very seriously. So how is it that we need to collect this data, but also for which purpose and its use? So from that perspective, I think, those key principles are important for then having more buy-in by Canadian different organizations to want to share their data, because they're going to know there are processes in place. For us, for example, it met very concretely, refine new data acquisition processes. All of this to say that when you have that in place, you do your privacy assessment, you're better able to promote and make people understand the need to share data, link data, and also to see how anonymized it is. So there's data literacy. I think we need to do more work to establish trust, and what I would say, more and more mutual purposes around data sharing.
Oh, great, thank you for that context, Lucie. Soyean, I'm going to go over to you and allow you to broaden out the question here, because we've been talking about the benefits of sharing data, but the other notion we've heard at the same time is the importance of sharing of expertise, sharing of knowledge, and maybe even in terms of the context, not only talking about the aspect of sharing data, but how can we improve our coordination between the expertise held in our university and colleges, government, foundations, private organizations, so on. So Soyean, over to you for some insights in terms of that aspect of sharing. You get the broader question.
Get the broader question, okay. Just touching on one thing, I think the sort of, to add on Lucie's perspective on the data sharing aspect, and then I'll touch on that one bit. Just one thing I wanted to sort of share, that perspective of data stewardship. It's a huge responsibility, especially for big data and large amount of data, and then have that responsibility, and then especially in the context of data sharing. I mean, there's a risk that's involved in terms of sharing that data. I mean, don't get me wrong, we do a lot of collaboration, and we work with a number of researchers. We tend to do a lot of data sharing, but it's a huge amount of investment in terms of creating that pipeline so that we can actually securely and safely share that data. So I mean, I totally get the sort of frustration from research community and academic community in terms of inadequacy of data, but it is a huge responsibility from the perspective of data steward. Because it's literally, you have to put your name on it. And then in this age of a cyber incident, when it's a matter of when, not if, there's a huge sort of risk taking on the part of data stewards. So I just wanted to point that out. There's lots of technology I've seen, so we're kind of leveraging a lot of that, but it sort of represents the investment that we all need to make as public organizations or at the government, for example. So I totally hear Lucie's a perspective about governance and importance of privacy. So I just wanted to echo that. In terms of benefit, I mean, I can kind of talk about that experience of how we work with other researchers. This particular case in COVID context, we work with the computing science at SFU. So just speaking on that sort of benefit side of this collaboration, I think this is that risk-taking and decision-making on the organization like us in public sector or the government that, there's that benefit and also the risk. On the benefit side, I mean, it's certainly for us, that question that we're trying to solve, that very specific question around COVID. How do we increase our diagnostic capacity at scale, and how do we do that very quickly? So the collaboration was certainly helpful, and we actually ended up creating this infrastructure. So how do we easily share data with other researchers? So we're kind of in the process of putting that infrastructure. So again, these are the data pipeline that can, is able to transport a large amount of data, things like medical imaging, CT scans, and clinical charts, which are, largely untapped to date. I mean, there's been data mining and collaboration largely on the administrative data, which are very, very structured data, but we're actually broadening that up in terms of, hey, we see a lot of potential. And then we learned that based on this collaboration with SFU researchers and the case of chest X-ray model development, there's lots of potential in medical imaging sort of area alone that it's worth tapping into. And of course, it requires that collaboration. So I feel that the benefit of sort of collaborating with academia is that, yes, we'll try to solve this specific problem, but during that exercise, we learned a lot that here are the data that we have, here are the data we don't have, what are the process and operation we need to change in order to enable such innovation downstream. So I think there's a fair bit of talk about that divide between data that's generated at source and then people doing that kind of work, and then data, and then the group of people who's gonna ultimately tap into that process, right? That embedding of sort of modeler, for example, at the source. So we were able to sort of narrow that gap between I guess those two groups of people out of this collaboration, which I saw as a huge benefit and very, very helpful at the Providence.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Soyean. Mohammad, over to you in terms of this notion of not just sharing of data, but the notion of sharing of knowledge and expertise and collaboration and its role. And perhaps if you wanted some context for it, maybe what its role is in the next big thing that's thrown at us, the next curve thrown at us, maybe it's a new pathogen in that. So like, how can that even have the context of not only in this, what did we learn from SARS? What did we learn from COVID, and what's next? So over to you, Mohammad.
Thank you. That's a billion-dollar question. So I'll try my best at when we'll have the next pandemic or how to handle it. But from a perspective of data sharing, data stableness, and also something very important which was mentioned by Lucie, data literacy. And if I may add, I want to add another curve into it, which is data as intellectual property. Now, the reason I mention all these things from a perspective of data, and it will also play out how new pathogens, emerging pathogens will play into it, is our experiences. So just to get, and I think that the panelists will agree that at the moment, European Union has a very clear policy and also on privacy and data. Yet, when we were working with the government of the Netherlands, there was a single agreement. It had only 20 clauses, which was labeled as a data share agreement. You sign the agreement, and you can do, as long as the data is anonymized, the scientists and us have a very broad view what we can achieve. Just to give you a counterexample, working with Canadian institutions at that level, if you want the same kind of things coming out of a collaborative project, it would involve a 6-month review. So just to give you another example, we are working with one of a very large hospital chains in Ontario, and somewhere in that chain, the lawyers raised the question of data as intellectual property. Who owns it? And it took us 3 months and thousands of dollars in legal fees, not to mention, to point out that data as an intellectual property is infinitely reproducible. You can still have rights to it. Multiple entities have rights to it. You can transfer those rights as a hospital originating it. But it doesn't mean by transferring the rights, it's not a chemical compound. You still hold certain rights to that. Yeah. So from that perspective, when you have new pathogens, new things emerging, is the flow of data, is the data literacy, is the policy, which are going to shorten all of this. Right now we are in a reactive mode. We are reacting to the challenges. in order to handle pandemics and handle these kind of things. As Ted mentioned, we don't have to now explain to anybody what a pandemic is going to cost. So you need to go from a reactive mode to a proactive mode. And that's our message.
Okay. Well, and you've raised a lot of good things there, and we actually, before we go to the Q&A for the to the audience for their questions and that, because we've got a lot of interesting topics we haven't been able to touch on. Does anybody want? I'll give you. Anybody want a 30-second response to some of the things that Mohammad and Soyean had just raised in their last thing? Anyone? I thought I saw somebody unmute there. So given the time, this will also give a chance for the audience to see if they want to pose some questions relating to that. I wanted, we've sort of finished the first phase of our panel discussion here, and this is the time we really wanted to be able to follow up on some of the things that were raised, and we'll even allow our panel members to raise other questions for each other. But I thought we'd get things going by taking a look at the questions that have been posed into the QA section here. And the first question, which everybody can see there, I'll just summarize it right now. We note that while the Canadian data is mostly disaggregated by sex and somewhat by age, there's very limited understanding of cases, hospitalizations, and death broken out by different factors. The US has done this, and there's some compelling information, and the small Canadian studies indicate a similar story. Can you speak to any of these gaps we've seen and in terms of this? So maybe Carolyn, you would like to speak at all to any of the from that first question, and other people just raise their hand if they want to chime in. Carolyn, over to you.
Yeah, so to my knowledge, Canada was not collecting race ethnicity data routinely, and I don't think it was on the national case report form. It probably is on some provincial case report forms. That was one of the issues that the CanCOVID team that I mentioned before that was pulled together fairly early on and has a collaborative and really great, mutually supportive flavor among Canadian researchers and academics. That was one of the issues that they raised, and I think it is being addressed in Canada. It is clearly important. I would say from the point of view of, urgent actions, did we need to have a shutdown or not in March? That wasn't, a driver for answers that were of that level of urgency, but it is very important. So I think that's a gap that is known and is probably going to be addressed. Some of the small Canadian studies that you mentioned probably, we have data from Ontario and the Toronto area around inequality, and I know inequality in COVID cases, but also in the unintended consequences of the actions we've taken for COVID are at the tops of people's agendas provincially and nationally. And I don't think the picture is good, but I do think we are going to analyze those data and understand more about those inequalities.
Okay, thanks for that. And so anybody else like to add to Carolyn's response there and add their insights? In terms of that, so it looked like, okay, no other further things on that one there. So I'd like to move on. And being mindful of all the different questions that we have here, I'd like to get through as many as possible. So please feel free to continue to put them in. This is sort of related to the question there, in terms of not access to the data, but what can you do with the data? Because although we've talked about, certain data is not being collected in Canada, there's this notion of one of the attendees noticed right now, the willingness to analyze it. There is very little visualizations, et cetera, available compared to internationally, and some provinces still collect on paper or have significant reporting lags. So anybody care to comment in terms of what we're able to see, not only in terms of because we're not able to potentially not been collecting some data, but what we've been able to do with that data? Anybody care to comment on that, or even Ted, what people have been able to or not have been able to do it with it in the States? I'll just turn it over. Actually, Ted, since people have commented there's more of those things available in the States. Can you make an initial comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, I think we're still, even at this late stage or I would say sort of this middle stage of the pandemic, we're still finding our feet with this. So I can just say that even as early as this week, we had our first meeting of groups that were pulled together and funded by an organization called the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists, the function of which is to, bring together several modeling collaborations to help answer policy questions posed by state policymakers. So this effort is just getting off the ground and is building on the back of a lot of the types of volunteerism that Carolyn mentioned at the very outstart of this. So I think in terms of figuring out how those data are going to be used to help policymakers actually answer these questions, I think that the story is not yet closed here. I think there's tremendous opportunity moving forward as we have really positive news about vaccines, huge questions about how limited vaccines will be made available to have an equitable and optimal impact. I think I don't yet know the answer to that question.
Okay, so I'm going to prime Lucie here to say that I'm going to be turning it over to her in just a moment. But given that, again, she works with Statistics Canada, because we know that Statistics Canada not only deals with, collecting data, storing data, they are also known for how they're able to get these insights from data in terms of this. So I was just wondering, Lucie, your comments and what you think has potentially what is being done, could be done better in Canada, or why would you say, and from your perspective, why do you think there's this apparent view that, more information is available internationally and our reports in Canada are not as illuminating? Over to you, Lucie.
Oh my gosh, that is certainly a challenge we have seen in COVID that has kind of exposed a little bit. I think there's a mix of issue, whether it could range from buy-in to capacity to system deficiencies, and so from that, and lack of understanding again of the importance of data. But what we've seen now, and this is where I think there's more opportunity now than ever, now that all the eyes are on data. That for us, for example, around the crowdsource, we've done about 8. So we've been able, again, those are lots of limitation, but on the other hand, in terms of providing you a short snapshot of what the situation, we have also a specialized team on data and side, as you mentioned, in terms of story, and being able to provide. So what is it telling us? So we've done, the 8 crowdsource. There was one on the impact of COVID on Canadian, mental health, where we saw that it was, around women, young, Indigenous, perception of safety. Again, we're able to break it down by specific group, where we know different, ethnocultural group, different perception of safety, trust in institution, where again is very important in this time of where some key institution, even from the police, for example, has been questioned in terms of assurance safety. So trust in institution, very important. And we saw also parenting during pandemic. So all of that have been stories able out of the crowdsource to take them for what it is, but still, with all Canadian participating, has been able to provide some policymaker, decision maker right now to have those data points, to have the conversation around what's happening, and especially for the recovery.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And is anybody, before I go on to Ariana's question, anybody else want to add to what Lucie has had to say there?
Yeah, I can add a few points about health data. I know Stats Canada has a lot of rich data. They don't tend to collect healthcare system data, as far as I know, although Lucie, feel free to correct me if I'm getting that wrong. So I can speak from my limited knowledge of some of the limitations in Canada around health data in particular, which is clearly very relevant for COVID. One issue is that we have obviously a provincial system, and so it's very hard for data to leave provinces and get compiled nationally in healthcare. We've had provinces are not report, they don't want to report to Public Health Agency of Canada, maybe in case something makes them look bad, or there are issues around getting data out of provinces and compiled nationally, despite efforts like the Health Data Research Network that are trying to do some of that. There's also a big split in Canada around data gathered for quotes quality purposes and public health delivery, and data gathered with a research tag to it. So that's a real split that can really limit how data can be used. And there are some good reasons for that, but that's also a barrier. And then finally, within provinces, for example, here in BC, we have 5 different health authorities that are subdivided further geographically. And that makes sense, but it also means that something like contact tracing is done at the health authority or at the regional level. And those data, there isn't really a systematic collection of those. So we can't, for example, get an indicator this week of how overburdened are our contact tracers in the province, how many contacts are people reporting, how many phone calls are they having to make on a scale of 1 to 10, how frantic is the office. And those would be really important leading indicators for early warning systems for COVID. So I think there are some of those gaps. There also are people, we are a 10th the size of the US, but we do have, maybe on average a 10th the number of people who want to put out visualizations, and the question asked about visualizations and kind of automated reporting. Jens van Bergman here in BC is doing a lot of that, puts out a time series decomposition by health authority in BC and looks at growth. David Fisman's team has a GitHub that collects all the provincial data. So there are some of these dashboards that are being pulled out, but it is hard to get national level data.
Okay, we appreciate those additional comments. Anybody else like to comment on that question before I pass it on to what will probably be our final question? So
just a quick question on speaking about healthcare data. I mean, I think Lucie mentioned data literacy and things like that. There are lots of healthcare data that's still recorded in paper format, which is the reality here, especially in the sort of rural sites and things like that. So there's a fair bit of information that have not been digitized yet. So I think that's, we need to kind of consider as a factor that, we don't all live in cities, where Wi-Fi and everything exists, that allows ease of sort of transfer across different sort of systematic information. So we don't quite have that infrastructure all around Canada just yet. And in BC, that's certainly not the case. So this is sort of part of the journey. And then in the context of, what is the sort of ultimate system? And then, I think the adoption, it's going to be done in phases, I expect.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it gets back to what Ted commented about the less sexy side of data science, and public health has that flavor. And you don't get to unveil a new building if you say, I'm going to prevent a data flow problem in the next pandemic by digitizing my systems and updating public health information flow. It's not the same as unrolling a new building with a shiny new cancer treatment center. Public health has the sales problem that preventing a problem is hard to motivate. When you don't have it, people are not aware of the cost and the huge problem that you prevented. And so I think we've elected not to try to revamp our public health infrastructure in the middle of a pandemic, but we do need to revamp it.
Yeah. Great. So thanks for those insights there. What I wanted to do is go, we're getting short, almost to the end of our time here. I want to go through some questions as quickly as I can. One from Ariana on speaking of contact tracing. Canadian government put out the app many months ago, but it still says not reporting in my area. Wouldn't it be very important to get everyone reporting and using it around the country? Who wants to field that one? Understandably, nobody wants to field that one. That's a hot potato in terms of that. Even Minister Adrian Dix on the question didn't want to answer Rosemary Barton's question in terms of that.
What was the question? Sorry, was it the contact tracing one?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I can speak to it if you want.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great.
It is controversial. Okay, so thing one, we have gone for an exposure notification app, which hopefully would tell you if you had been exposed, if the person who exposed you had their positive test uploaded into the app. It doesn't track your location and inform anybody like me or anyone else about contact data, where your phone has been and all of that. One of the reasons it hasn't been adopted across the country is that the exposure window was set to 14 days. And I think they were worried about a notification pandemic of just everybody will appear notified all the time if you go back 14 days before symptoms. That, of course, could change. The code is available on GitHub. You can look at it. It's COVID Alert or COVID Shield. One of those is the GitHub. I think uptake of apps hasn't been super high in places where they did expect a very high uptake. And, with exposure events are fundamentally pairs of people, right? One with COVID and one without that's you if you're looking for a notification on the app. So unless a large portion of the population uses the app, I think it's of limited effectiveness. That said, it's a tool in the toolkit that we have that we could deploy today. So maybe we should be thinking about it. But those are some of the conversations around it.
Okay, great, thanks. And there's two questions. I wish I could get to both of them. I have to go for the shorter question. So this would be probably a question that everybody out there in the audience would have is, what would you recommend for policymakers and decision makers, governments basically? So I'm going to give everybody 15 seconds to respond to that one. And in terms of that, so putting people on the spot, it's Ted, you're next up on my screen here. So you're on the spot first. 15 seconds. What would you recommend for policymakers and decision makers as we go around the table here?
Well, I think there's a lot of grist for this one. My take home from this is that we cannot rely on the goodwill, and as important as agility is, I think it would be foolish for us not to be proactive in developing relationships now, thinking forward to the future. Putting together these types of collaboration takes a great deal of trust, and that is very difficult to build in the middle of a pandemic. So I think this requires a real investment. The idea of sort of just-in-time public health, we're seeing the aftermath of that, and I don't think it's a way to move forward.
Okay, I appreciate those insights there. For a few seconds, it's going to be Soyean, you're next in line here, and then planning ahead, Lucie, you'll be after Soyean.
To be briefly, I think we live in a day and age where we cannot no longer ignore the power of data. And then I think as a public sector organization or a government, we need to do our best to be mature and that sort of decision-making and risk-taking, so that we can share data more broadly with researchers and partners, and really for the benefit of the common good. So, I mean, we talk about this great topic about, narrowing down and then, eliminating that gap, between who's going to be tapping into these sites and processing, and then, the government or public sector organization who are data generators. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area. And then just for a selfish perspective, advocating for, innovation in healthcare. Most of healthcare data to date is untapped. This is a gold mine. Things like a medical chart, CT scans, all of that. It's largely untapped and remains that way. So I think there's much work to be done in that area. And then I think a lot really relies on the government and public sector organizations who are data stewards, and then to take that next step to mature. And then take the risk, and then make the right decisions and to enable that innovation infrastructure.
Great. Okay, Lucie, and then it'll be Mohammad after Lucie. So over to you, Lucie. Your brief response.
Yes. Well, me, I would say, which is an example of why I'm here today in terms of networks and communities of practice that we all need, especially now in the time of COVID and virtualization of our world, to exchange on data practices, how we're modernizing, and for some sectors, as it was mentioned, it's really a data revolution. It's not just a modernization. So across different sector, segment of society, and I think for us, definitely we see that as an agency in terms of making data more accessible. And the way to do it is to lead ourselves, to more innovative, open way and transparent way to do business, and also create accessible, credible, and inclusive partnership for the way we want to collect data, disseminate, and all the way, not just at the end where we get to a user, but to have a more co-development in the way we approach data sharing.
Oh, excellent. Mohammad, for a quick 30 seconds, over to you before Carolyn. Mohammad. Oh, muted.
Thank you. So two things. One, have a clear, unified Canadian policy on what constitutes data, anonymized data, sharing of it, and the rights assigned to it. We already have an example of the European Union. Second, for hospital networks and hospitals, places like places which are represented by Soyean, please do not look at data with dollar signs. You are not an organization which is going to commercialize it. So stop looking at it like that. Stop reading more meaning into it, what intellectual property of data means. Get your own proactive policies in so you can share it with SMEs. The economic benefit will be larger and will come to you, but don't look at it with dollar signs.
Great. Okay, Carolyn, 30 seconds to you before I turn it over to Sam for him to do the quick summary of the beautiful image there. Carolyn.
Okay, I will say 3 things, and I will try to say them in 30 seconds. 1, reestablish something like the Global Public Health Intelligence Network, which does scan and surveillance for pandemics and would be able to catch these things, emerging zoonotic infections very soon. That was unfortunately stopped just before COVID emerged because we hadn't had one for a while. 2, build a just in case, jumping off of Ted's point, public health system, not a just-in-time public health system. The next one of these could have had a 10%. We could have had a 10% case fatality rate instead of a 1%, and we would have had to act very differently. And 3, do that by building those relationships right now with data people, with modelers, with public health implementers, with social and behavioral scientists, with decision makers, with public health organizations across the country, and have those relationships in place with the idea that for that just in case event, there are people who have the capacity to drop whatever they're doing, people based at universities, people based in other sectors who will be able to drop whatever they're doing and will have the skill set and relationships to really build up from that just in case basis for public health in the next pandemic.
Great, thanks very much. And I'm turning it over to Sam here so that he has a couple minutes, 2 or 3 minutes to review this, and then we'll wrap it up. Sam, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you with the panel presentation today. You know, as a person who uses the public healthcare system, I'm super excited about hearing the innovation that's possible when we work together and in deeper collaboration. So I just want to orient you a little bit to the 3 main areas of this graphic that's been created. And one of the questions that we always get is, will the graphic be available? And yes, it will be available. We're going to put it out soon after this session. So on the left-hand side, I've begun with a computer, but it's actually a computer that's networking people together. And so zooming in on some data points, maybe it's a model, it's actually faces because it all comes back to people. And then from the model, we have the curve asking the question of what is the next curve, and branching off from the curve, we have things like what will be the next pathogen? What are ways that we can have agile partnerships that are in true collaboration? Underneath, we have the idea of the flow of data moving across. So connecting people, but then talking about the sharing benefits. And then what are types of data that are needed, leading to what is this inconsistency that we have between the public sharing all sorts of things around our shopping habits, but not around the things that are really important to public health. And then more about big data and what collaboration looks like and coordination on this side. Throughout, there are the key takeaways. So there's been a bit of like the just in case public health, looking at race-based data collection, data stewardship, data literacy. And so those are all gems and nuggets that are sprinkled throughout. So I look forward to sending it out to everyone who has been joining us today. Back to you, Fred.
Thanks very much. And yes, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining in today. First, I want to thank all of our panelists for taking amidst, I know that there are a lot of things happening right now, so I really appreciate everyone's time. Thanks very much to them. Thanks very much to the team that was behind here for not only the organization, but the delivery of it. And I'm so glad, Sam, that we'll be able to take a look at this, at the image in detail to see if our actions, the insights that we can get from these images in terms of making more sense of our data. So really what I've taken home from today is, you know, hey, there's a lot of the importance, not just of data, but it's of the people, it's of the communication between people. And these are very challenging problems to solve, but we need to work out them together. And we need to be working at it not just in case, but we not just as in response to disasters, but in case we might have these disasters. So I think that was an important closing comment there. So it's encouraging that we are able to harness the power of data, of technology, of modeling, of analytics to enable policymakers to basically navigate this complex area of disruption that we have here. And we're happy to play a role here at, I am happy at Simon Fraser University and across Canada to play a role in bringing people together to solve all of these problems. So you have everybody's names here, but feel free to reach out to me at Popowich at sfu.ca, or just visit our website at sfu.ca/big-data, big-data, where we really look forward to bringing people together to do what we can to improve action and collaboration to get value from data and to have real impact in society. Thanks very much to everyone for joining today, and looking forward to connecting with you in the near future. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.